Today we're going to be talking about a simple aerodynamic device called the Gurney flap and how it can be used to increase the performance on the wing of your car. We're going to talk about what a Gurney flap is, how it works, how it was invented, all that jazz. But before we do that, I'm going to need you guys to understand a few basic concepts and a few geometries and terminology in aerodynamics. And we're not going to get too fancy, but just a few basics we need to understand. To begin, we need to become familiar with the geometry and some of the terms of airfoils and wings. So let's begin with the basic drawing of an airplane. When we look at the three-dimensional wing of this airplane, we can take a two-dimensional cross-section. So that's like taking a slice of this wing, say right there. And if I were to look at that slice, it would look something like that. So this is a three-dimensional wing, and I've taken a two-dimensional slice, and I'm looking at that slice here. That's called the airfoil, and this is the airfoil shape. So, not all airfoils are symmetric like this one. You might see some on some racing, racing cars, which are a lot fancier. It might look something like that. This is a cambered airfoil. Or, you might see a spoiler on an economy class sedan, just driving down the road, and that's just simply maybe just a flat plate. So again, these are the two-dimensional cross sections or slices of the wing. So if I were to take, say, a spoiler, and I would make it into 3 dimensions, I would have myself a nice spoiler to go in the back of my, Chrysler Crossfire car. All right, so this is the correlation between three-dimensional wings and the shape of a two-dimensional airfoil. Now that we understand that, let's talk about some of the parameters that we use to describe airfoil shapes and geometries. So for this, we're going to use the symmetrical, airfoil here. And first off, how we categorize this airfoil is with the length dimensions. So how long the airfoil is. We call that the chord, or C. And the chord connects the leading edge of the airfoil to the trailing edge of the airfoil. And this is basically just tip to tip. Another parameter, say we're driving down, driving on the road, we have a wing on the back of our car, and this is the airfoil of that wing. So as we're driving along, air is flowing over this wing, and we can draw this airflow like this. Now, our wing is canted downwards. So the angle that it's canted downwards, we call that angle, so that's here, alpha, or the angle of attack. And the geometry of this airfoil, combined with the angle of attack, produces forces on the wing. And these forces are broken down into 2 components. The first one, which almost everyone should know, if we look at an airplane, is called lift. So lift acts upward on an aircraft to allow the airplane to fly. But in a car application, everything is upside down. We don't want the car to produce lift and start flying off the road. No, we want the exact opposite. We want the car to hug the road. We want it to get pushed down on the road so that we get more traction for the tires, so we can take great, faster turns or whatever and not have the tires slip. So that's why the wings and the airfoils are all upside down compared to an airplane. And this way, the wing produces force downwards, and instead of calling this negative lift, which we could have called it, we call it downforce. So just like I was in an airplane, we want more lift. More lift is good. We want more downforce in our car application. We want the car to hug the road as much as possible so we can get as much traction as possible. Alright, that's one of the forces. The other force component is angled backwards here, and that's called drag. So both airplanes and cars produce drag. And this is a negative force, so it impedes your motion, so it slows you down. So, just like how in airplanes, on cars, we want to decrease the drag as much as possible so we can go faster, or not use as much gas for going the same speed. So the drag acts backwards, and the downforce acts down, and these are the basic forces that act on the wing of a car. Now, you might ask yourself, how are these forces generated? Well, you're going to have to take a course in aerodynamics to figure out the real reason, and you're going to have to do a lot of math to do that. But to give you the basics, what happens is, as the air is flowing over this geometry of this wing, a high pressure is produced on the top of the wing, and a low pressure is produced on the bottom. So this high pressure air is pushing down on the wing, and this low pressure air is still pushing up on the wing, but not as much as the air up here. So that creates a net force down and also a net force back. That produces the downforce and the drag. So that's just the basics. To figure out the actual values of these forces, you actually have to do some math, and it's not too much work, but it's quite a bit. And again, this is the exact opposite of on an airplane. We have high pressure on the bottom of the wing and low pressure on the top for an airplane. That's why the force is upwards. So these are the basics we need to know for talking about Gurney flaps. And again, just to recap, downforce is good. We want more downforce, and drag is bad. We don't want drag, so we want to decrease this force. Now we're ready to talk about Gurney flaps in particular. So what is a Gurney flap? Well, if we look at, again, our two-dimensional airfoil, a Gurney flap is a small plate that's attached to the trailing edge of the airfoil, perpendicular, so at 90 degrees, to the chord line of our airfoil. And again, the Gurney flap is attached to the high pressure side. So on an airplane, it would be on the bottom. But since we're talking about cars, which everything is inversed, it's on the top. Now, the Gurney flap was invented by Dan Gurney in the 1970s, and it was invented actually before being used on airplanes. It was invented for cars. So he used it on a race car, and what he found is that it decreased the drag and it increased the downforce. So remember, the drag acts this way, and the downforce acts this way. So by decreasing the drag, he found that his car had a faster lap time, had faster top speeds. And by increasing the downforce, he found that it could take corners at a faster speed without having the tire slip. So these are both beneficial things. Less drag, higher downforce, greater top speed, greater turning speed. But his findings were a bit anomalous because he was using it on a very thick airfoil. He did find that it did both decrease the drag and increase the downforce. However, he took these findings to a researcher, to an aerodynamicist called Liebeck, and Liebeck actually did some mathematical investigation into what was happening, and he postulated, what does the flow look like in this region of the airfoil? How does it affect the downforce and the drag? To give you an idea of a production car that uses a Gurney flap, we look to American Muscle. And yes, that's right, the 2010-2011 Shelby GT500 amazingly uses a Gurney flap. As you can see here on the back spoiler of the car, there's a small raised carbon fiber element, and this is a small Gurney flap that they've added to the back spoiler. To visualize the flow situation of a wing using a Gurney flap, we're going to take a look at the two-dimensional airfoils, one using a Gurney flap and one not using a Gurney flap, and we're going to draw the flow field, and then we're going to discuss what this means in terms of forces. So first off, let's take a look at the wing that's not using a Gurney flap. So let's say in both cases that these are wings that are attached to the back of my car. I go for a drive, so there's air flowing over top of these wings. So in the case of a wing that doesn't use a Gurney flap, what's going to happen is the air is going to follow the top surface and the bottom surface pretty well. And then near the back, it's going to separate and form something called vortices. And vortices are recirculating regions of flow. You can do a simple experiment to visualize what vortices are. Put your hand in the bathtub next time you're taking a bath and move it quickly through the bathtub, and you'll see vortices being formed behind your hand. These are just recirculating regions of water in this case, but in here it's air. Okay, so that's the case for no Gurney flap. Now, say I take up my car that has a wing with a Gurney flap, and I go for a drive. Okay, same case. I'm going to have airflow over the top and airflow over the bottom. All right, first here, some of the air on the top surface is going to hit this Gurney flap, which is basically a flat plate. It's a barrier to flow. It's going to stop, and it's going to change direction and form a recirculating region. The airflow on the top surface that doesn't hit the Gurney plate or Gurney flap is going to reach this point, and now it's going to find a sharp corner which you can't turn, so it's going to separate and form vortices just like it did here. All right, on the bottom surface, the air is going to follow until it reaches this point where again it has to make a sharp turn which it can't follow, so it's going to separate and form vortices. So although these situations look fairly similar, there are a couple very subtle differences which change the force distribution on these two airfoils, and we're going to go through that now. So one of the differences you can see is in the case of the Gurney flap, there's this region of recirculating flow here, which doesn't occur on the wing without a Gurney flap. Another thing you might have noticed if you were fairly astute is that these vortices seem to be angled in this direction, so they're flowing downstream in this direction. But these vortices are angled differently. They're angled in that direction, so they're actually flowing up more than this one, where this one's just flowing back. So these are the two main differences for these two different wings. One more thing you might have noticed, actually, if you were really astute, really paying attention, is that on this airfoil, the bottom surface separated and formed this recirculating region before reaching the end here. But on this one, it actually reached the end before forming those recirculating regions. So these 3 points are what determines the different force distributions in these two airfoils. So let's talk about those now. In our introduction, we said that the forces, the downforce and the drag on wings, on cars, are from two basic mechanisms, or two basic things. And that's having a high pressure on top and a low pressure on the bottom. So we're just going to talk about the wing with the Gurney flap now. All right, so the high pressure on the top and low pressure on the bottom causes a downforce. And it causes a drag. Okay. Now, how does this Gurney flap change this force distribution? Or, does it add downforce? Does it add drag? Well, if we look at this region here, the recirculating region where the flow actually hits the Gurney plate and turns around and starts, flowing inwards like that. Well, there's a simple analogy to this. Everyone's done this. Driving in your car, you stick your hand out the window, and you form a flat plate. And the airflow is hitting your hand, and you can feel the force pushing it back. Well, what's happening, it's similar to this situation, is that a high pressure is being formed on the front of your hand, and a lower pressure is being formed on the back side of your hand, and this causes a net force pushing your hand back, which is drag. So this case here was a higher pressure in front and a lower pressure behind causes a net drag increase from the Gurney flap. Okay, so that's one contribution, is net drag from that mechanism here, the analogy with your hand out the window. Okay, still talking about drag here. One more thing is that this recirculating region is different than this one. Like we mentioned before, this one separated before this one. And what that means, we're not going to go into the detailed aerodynamics here, but what it means is that because this has a greater region of attached flow, so it doesn't separate until the very edge where this one separated much sooner, that actually decreases the drag. So there's a drag decrease because of a larger region of attached flow. So these two mechanisms oppose each other. One increases the drag and one causes the drag to decrease. Well, we were talking before with Dan Gurney when he originally invented this device and he attached it to his racing car. He found that the drag decreased. Well, that only happens in very specific cases where he had a very, very thick airfoil, so this is very, very thick. And in that case, this contribution actually outweighs this one, so your drag decreases. But in most airfoils, which are much, much skinnier, most airfoils used on cars today on airplanes, this increase will be much greater than this one, and you're going to find a drag increase. So Gurney flaps actually increase the drag on your car. All right, now that we've talked about drag, let's talk about downforce. So there's, again, two mechanisms for increasing the downforce. The first one is that, again, just like in the drag situation, there's a larger region of attached flow. So on this case, the flow attached sooner, and this one it stayed, or flow separated sooner, and on this one it stayed attached much longer. Okay, well let's just draw a few simple diagrams here to sort of get a better feel for this. So let's just erase this here and draw a few airfoils. Okay, so the same airfoil, but at different angles of attack. So this one, we're going to say, is at 0 degrees angle of attack. This one, because it's canted down more, let's say it's at, 15 degrees angle of attack. And this one, because it's really, really heavily canted down, let's say it's at 45 degrees. Okay, so how does the flow differ in these different situations? Well, in this one with a very small angle of attack, the flow remains attached. It follows the surface, there's no sharp turns, nothing fancy, so it stays attached. And your downforce is pretty good. As we increase the angle of attack, so we're getting to 15 degrees here, flow on the top will be fine. The flow on the bottom is having trouble. Near the back here it separates. You can't quite make it to the very end. It actually separates before it reaches the end. And this, because your angle of attack is greater, your lift does increase, but it's getting a little bit dangerous here because your flow is separating. Well, at very, very high angles of attack, your flow has no chance in hell. It can't follow this turn at all, so it separates right away. And this forms these vortices which, recirculate downstream. And in that case, your lift basically just goes away. You have no more downforce. So this is a very negative situation. You don't want that to happen. But what we talked about before is we want, as we increase the angle of attack, lift force actually does increase, even though you're getting that sort of dangerous condition of separation. But you don't want to increase it too much, or else it's going to catastrophically fail where you have full separation and your lift just goes away completely. So there's conflicting, there's conflicting parameters here. We want to increase angle of attack, but not too much that this catastrophic failure happens. So, comparing again the two situations, one with a Gurney flap and one without, with a Gurney flap, at any angle of attack, if it's the same angle of attack as the airflow without a Gurney flap, we're going to have more attached flow. And that means I can actually go to a higher angle of attack. I can cant this airfoil down more and more and more than this one, and I can still get lift. I don't have that catastrophic failure. So that's good. I can get more lift out of this without having any failure. And that's one mechanism which increases the downforce. The other one is what we talked about before, where these vortices that are being shed off, off this Gurney flap and off this airfoil are actually angled upwards, whereas in this case they were angled back. Well, because they're angled up, that's a momentum, increase going up, which means by Newton's second law that the downforce must increase. So that's another mechanism for increasing downforce. So in summary, the Gurney flap has two mechanisms for drag. One creates more drag, one decreases the drag. And when you add those two contributions up, you get the net increase in drag. And usually, except for very special extreme circumstances, the Gurney flap increases your drag. There's two mechanisms for creating more downforce. So this is a fairly complicated discussion. And if you want to understand, the details of it, you're going to have to take an aerodynamics course or Introduction to Aerodynamics. But these was sort of the basics of what's happening. And again, the Gurney flap increases your downforce and increases your drag. The final thing to talk about here is how big should I make a Gurney flap? If I decide to put a Gurney flap on the wing of my car, how big should it be? Okay, well let's look at four cases. One is a wing without a Gurney flap. One is a wing with a Gurney flap that is 1.25% of the chord. So if your chord of your wing is, say, 30 centimeters, then the height of your Gurney flap is 1.25% of that. Let's look at one where it's 2.5% of the chord and one that's 5% of the chord. Now these are greatly exaggerated, but it's just because I couldn't actually draw 1% or 2%. So we're going to look at two things. One is downforce and one is drag. And like we talked about before, the downforce is going to increase, which is good, and the drag is going to increase, which is bad. So we need to quantify this to see, what should I do? What size should I choose? Well, taking the airfoil that has nothing, no Gurney flap, as a baseline, so just at the axis here, let's first look at the 1.25%. And if you look through the literature, some researchers who've done simulations and experiments with these Gurney flaps, they found that the downforce increases by about 20 to 30%. And they've also found that the drag doesn't really increase at all. Nothing appreciable. So basically what they found is that you get 20 to 30% more downforce with no negative benefit. This is wonderful. I mean, you could slap on a little piece of metal on your rear wing of your car and get 20 to 30% more downforce, which is the reason why you put a wing on your car anyway. And there's no drag penalty. Awesome. Well, maybe if this is great, I can make the Gurney flap bigger and get even better gains. Well, let's take a look. 2.5%, you're going to get about 30 to 40% increase in lift. Or downforce, sorry. But when you get this big, you're going to find drag increases as well. The drag is a little bit harder to estimate than the downforce because it's going to be a little bit more complicated, a little bit more dependent on the geometry of your specific wing. But as a guess, as a rough figure, we're going to say anywhere from 20 to 50% increase. Okay, so it's going to increase your drag, but it also increases your downforce even better. Awesome. What if we go up to 5%? Well, it increases your downforce by 40 to 50%, but it can also increase your drag dramatically, anywhere from 20 to 100%. So it can double your drag. Well, that's not very ideal. I mean, you do get 50% more downforce, but you have the potential to double your drag on your wing. So, taking this all into consideration, you really have to think about what are your goals? What do you really want? In an airplane and in a car, there's different goals. So in an airplane, it's all about efficiency. They want to have the most efficient airplane so they don't have to use as much gas getting from point A to point B. Unless the airplane is designed to, say, carry as much weight as possible. So it's a bomber. You don't really care about how much fuel it's going to use, but you care about how much weight it can carry. Well, in that case, increasing your lift or your downforce by 50%, that's fine. You get drag increases. You don't care how much fuel you got to use to pump those engines, to higher power. You want to get more. You want to lift more off the ground. You're going to have more lift. But in most cases, like in a passenger jet or in most aircraft, it's all about efficiency. So they don't like these drag increases, even though these lift increases might be kind of nice. They hate these drag increases. So if anything, the only thing they would choose is the 1.25%, which has no drag increase. But that's for airplanes. When we talk about cars, you might have different goals. And that might be, you want to take a corner faster. You don't want to have your tires slip. So you might want to, corner faster. And that means you need to get as much downforce as possible. So you want to get, maybe you can make your wing bigger. You could do anything, you could put rocks in the back of your car to increase that downforce. But if you really want to get, take those corners as fast as possible, you want to put the Gurney flap on as big as possible. And I would only go to about 5%. I wouldn't go any bigger than that. So you're going to get 50% more downforce, and you're going to get a lot more drag, which means your engine's going to have to work harder. But when you think about it, in these race cars and cars today, performance cars, you can get 500, 600, 1,000 horsepower. This small, relatively small increase in drag is not that big compared to the power the engine can output. So choosing this large Gurney flap is going to be the best choice for that race car that wants to take those corners as fast as possible. And in that case, you're going to see these large Gurney flaps, which if you look at some race cars, some high-performance vehicles, actually I got a few pictures here you can take a look at. There's the Gumpert cars. You can look at Formula race cars. You'll all see these large Gurney flaps pointing up on the back of these wings. And that's exactly for this reason. So, maybe you want to have the highest top speed. It's going to be a, more complicated, trade-off than what I'm talking about here. You're going to have to specialize your car to what you want. Do you want the most downforce possible? Can you live with this drag increase? I don't know. Do your tires slip when you're accelerating or when you're at high speeds? You might want more downforce. Is your engine super powered? Fine, drag increase doesn't matter. Is your engine not that powerful? You might not want these drag increases then. You might want to stick to something a little bit smaller and get some nice benefits in downforce, but not so much drag increase. But in the end, no matter what you choose, what comes out of this is that Gurney flaps are amazingly simple. It's a little piece of metal that you put at the back of your wing. You can bolt it to the back of your wing, you can weld it to the back of your wing. It's not a fancy shape, it's just a square piece of metal. You can get an L bracket or something and put it on the back of your wing. It's got to point up, You can choose the height to whatever you want, but the bottom line is that it increases your downforce, and though it increases your drag, it's not that much compared to how much downforce you get. So for car applications, it is a mechanically simple and amazing device that if you have a wing on your car, or you're considering getting a wing, you should think about putting this on. And if you have any more questions, you want to maybe discuss with me your specific application, send me a message. We can talk, and we can come to a decision of what size gurney flap do you need that's going to benefit you the most. Again, any questions, send me an email, send me a private message on YouTube. I'd be happy to answer.